So I guess everybody wants to hear stories, right? Interesting stories of being a mohel, right?
Who wants to know if you ever messed up?
Everyone wants to mess. But I'll tell you a case. I'll tell you an interesting case where I had a tremendous panic, and it was nothing. It was a funny story. I did a bris on second day Pesach in New Haven. And I bandaged the baby up, and I gave the mother, like I always do, detailed instructions how to take care of the post-op of the baby. In any event, I went home. The next morning I'm davening. It's first day Chol Moed. And I get a call from the parents. They're frenetic. I said, what's going on? They said, the bandage is too tight. The baby hasn't gone to the bathroom all night. I thought, oh my God, failure, like Chalil V'chas. So I ripped my tefillin off. We wear tefillin on Chol Moed. And I ran with my bris bag to the person's house. I gallop up the stairs. I say, where's the baby? They give me the baby. The baby's screaming bloody murder. So I look, and I was astonished. There's like this stuff is all over the baby's stomach. So I look some more, and I realize that the diaper's coming apart. So I said to the parents, when did you last change this baby? They said, well, we were nervous. We haven't changed him since the bris. I said, you haven't changed a baby in 18 hours? No wonder why the kid is screaming. Of course he went to the bathroom. Look what he's done. The diaper's falling apart. So I just took the diaper right off, and Baruch Hashem was fine. But other than that, Baruch Hashem, we've done pretty well. My most interesting story with bris milah actually involves a very fascinating chain of events. I was called by a father who calls me up and he says to me, I want you to do a bris milah, it was a grandfather really, for my daughter's child. Okay. So he starts telling me my daughter married a non-Jewish man. He starts telling me how terrible it was. And will you please come and do the bris? I said, no problem. So he says, when's the bris? The bris is on Hoshana Rabbah. That's a very busy day, right, in the calendar, because we have like a 3-hour davening, and then we have to have a meal, and we got to get ready. So I told the father, listen, I'm going to come down to do the bris. Please be on time. Make sure the daughter's on time, the grandkid's on time. Fine. I get down there. First thing I notice is that the grandfather, who gave me a big speech about doing a big mitzvah on the bris of his daughter who's married to a non-Jew, is there with a non-Jewish woman. So I turn around and I say, hold on a second, is this girl even Jewish? So I go over to the guy, and the guy says to me, the grandfather says to me, no, this is the person, the second one, right? And the girl's mother is Jewish and she's divorced and whatever. Okay, I said it's a little interesting because you told me it was a big mitzvah to do for your daughter who's married to a non-Jew and whatever, but we'll drop that. So I did the bris, and Baruch Hashem, the bris was fine, and all was good, and I go home. About 3 months later, I get a call from the grandmother, the divorced grandmother. And she says to me, do you remember you did the bris on my grandson? I said, sure, I remember. She said it was Sukkot, and you were there. I said, I remember everything. So she says, well, I need help. I said, what's the matter? She said, you remember the man who hired you, the grandfather? Maybe I said, of course. Well, he's with a non-Jewish. I said, of course, but I don't know, still I can't figure out what you want. She said, well, here's the problem. I'm dating a Jewish man, about a 50-year-old Jewish man, and he told me that he's not going to marry me unless I get a Jewish divorce from my original husband. Could you please arrange that? Okay. So I have the number. I call back the grandfather. I said, how are you? How's the grandson? He's doing fine. I said, listen, a funny thing happened. You remember you were married to this woman 20 years ago? He says, I remember. I said, well, she needs a get from you. He says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. We've been divorced for 20 years. I said, listen to me. It doesn't make a difference. You could have been divorced for 50 years. I said, but you never had a Jewish divorce. You need a Jewish divorce. So he said, okay, Rabbi, how much will it cost? So I tell him the price, about $500 each side. He says, listen to me, I'm a used car dealer. I'll give you a used car instead. I said, I don't want your used car. I want you to pay me the money. So he says, why do I have to do this? So I say, listen, it's not nice to this lady. You're not living with her anyways. Just be a mensch. Give her the get. And we'll all move on with our lives. So we arranged a time for the get. Of course, it was a Sunday. Of course, Thursday night, he calls me. He says, I'm not coming to the get. I said, oh, God. I said, all right, we'll do it for free. He said, I'll come. So I called the woman up. I said, listen, them's the breaks. You're going to pay the full $1,000 and you'll have your get. So Sunday rolls around, the guy comes, the get's given. She goes home. 2 months later, I get a call from the lady. She's hysterical. She's fuming mad. I said, ma'am, what's the matter? She said, do you remember that you did a get for me? I said, of course, you had the get. We did the get. It's all done. The bris, the get, we're done. She said, well, I got the get because this gentleman who actually lives in my town, his name is Josh. Josh promised me that if I would get the get, he'd marry me. He said he couldn't marry me because I didn't have a get. I said, so what's the matter? Well, he said he's not marrying me now. So I said, well, what do you want from me? He said, could you please call, you know him, could you please call him up? Please ask him what's going on. It's not fair. So I called the guy up. I said, I understand that you told this lady that you couldn't marry her because she didn't have a get. Well, apparently she got the get. I was the one who gave it. And now she's astonished. What's going on? You promised to marry someone. He says, I never said that to her. I said, so she lied? No, she didn't lie. I told her, listen, if you want to get married to me, you need a get. I never told her I'd marry her, but I just said that's obviously a prerequisite. She heard it the wrong way, so she went ahead and got a get. So I had no intention of marrying her. So I said, you know, I don't mean to interfere, but that's a really odd thing to do to someone. Like, you misled someone. He said, Rabbi, I don't see it like that. Matter of fact, I see it that I did a mitzvah. I got the lady a get. I said, Josh, let me tell you something. You have an awfully funny way of doing mitzvahs. And that was that. So it's very interesting. And the reason for this is that when you go into a person's house to do a bris, you really have a chance to guide them through a very important life-changing event. Many Jewish people, even if those who aren't as affiliated, give their children a ritual bris milah. And it's a time of high emotion. It's a time when someone's continuing something, a chain that began all the way back from Avram Avinu. Because our forefather Abraham, he was commanded to give himself a bris milah at a very, very old age. And when his son Yitzchak was born, God told him to give him a bris at 8 days old. So it's really that first mitzvah that linked the first father and son, and so too it links every father and son as we go down the generations. That everybody gives their son a bris milah. And it's at this important point that I feel very privileged as a mohel that you're involved with the family and you really guide them at this crucial link as they add another link to that chain of Yiddishkeit that stretches all the way back to our forefather Abraham, to Avram Avinu. But I think it's important practically to understand what a bris is, right? Right? So everybody always says, you cut the top of the thing off, which is ridiculous. Okay? So basically there are 3 parts to a bris milah, right? The first part of the bris milah is cutting off the foreskin, right? The arla. And then we peel back the inner skin. And finally, we make sure that the blood of the baby is properly in a way that it could properly heal, and that's called mitzitza. So there's 3 parts to a bris milah. But in order for a bris milah to be a valid bris milah, it has to be done, I should say, by a valid mohel. It is not a surgical procedure. And it has to happen when the baby is 8 days old or after 8 days old. If it happens before the baby is 8 days old, then you're not doing what God commanded. So again, it is not considered a kosher bris. So a kosher bris has to be performed by a mohel, someone who's trained in the laws and who's a Jewish man who keeps the mitzvos. And it has to happen preferably when the baby is 8 days old or any time thereafter that the baby is 8 days old. Now the responsibility to give a child a bris milah is a responsibility on the father, like God commanded Abraham to give Yitzchak a bris milah. But the reality is that every Jewish person, once he becomes bar mitzvah, if he hasn't had a bris milah, then like any other mitzvah, the responsibility devolves on himself to make sure he has a bris milah. So, of course, it begins as the father's responsibility. It's one of the mitzvos that a father must do for his son. But if the bris has not happened for the son, and the son is a Jewish man who now turns 13, then he is responsible to ensure that he himself has a bris milah, that he himself has a kosher bris. And of course, the last part of bris milah is to make sure the child is properly bandaged. A mohel is responsible for that too. You, God forbid, can't leave a child in a situation where he could bleed. So that's also mentioned in the Gemara as a key part in bris milah. Now I'll mention one last point, because there's much discussion about the medical benefits of bris milah. It's been written about extensively. And of course, all that's very nice. We do a bris milah because it's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Avram to give to Yitzchak, to give to Yaakov. It's the sign within each and every one of us that we're Jewish. And it's also the imprint that we give a child with the understanding that no matter what the person does in his life, if sometimes he strays from the path, if sometimes he goes far away, he always has that stamp of a Jew that's immutable, that's not changeable. That connection to God and to the rest of the Jewish nation can never change. And therefore, it's one of the ideas why it's the first mitzvah we do with a Jewish child. Because we do a mitzvah that's going to stay with him the rest of his life, that's going to connect him to his heritage, irrespective of what action he takes. Yes?
Where did the idea of the 8 days come from? If Abraham had it later in life, so where do you get, if he was the first person to have a bris, Abraham?
Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded in the Torah to give his son a bris when he was 8 days old.
Okay.
So it's that point that's immutable in a Jewish person, that connects him to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to the rest of the nation. And that can't change, no matter what a person does in his life. That core that each and every one of us has in our souls and on our bodies eternally connects us to the rest of the nation in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's an assurance that no matter how far a Jewish person strays, he has that bris milah, there's always an opportunity for him to come back. But, it is very interesting, the medical benefits of a bris milah. There's much conversation that on the 8th day, it's when the clotting factor is highest. You could read about this in medical literature. But I will tell you one fascinating thing. And I'm not saying that's the exact interpretation. I believe it is. But it shows you how Chazal, thousands of years ago, were aware of certain medical concepts that we've only become aware of relatively recently. There's a Gemara in Yevamos. The Talmud Yevamos states that there's a woman who came before one of the Tanaim and said, "My child perished after having a bris milah." Now we know a very interesting halacha, that if you have 3 siblings, the first 2 perish after having a bris milah, God forbid, you're not allowed to give a bris milah to the 3rd child, because it's established that there's a problem. So there's a woman that came to one of the Tanaim and said, "My child perished after a bris milah." And then her sister, the same thing. And when it came to the 3rd and 4th sister, the Tana said, you cannot give your child a bris milah because it's dangerous. There's a famous machlokas, a famous argument in the Shulchan Aruch. The Mechaber writes, Rav Yosef Karo writes, based on Rabbeinu Manoach, one of the Rishonim, that would apply if 2 children of the same father perish after having a bris milah. The 3rd son also cannot have a bris milah, irrespective of what wife the father had and how many wives he had. As long as it was sequential, the 3rd child cannot, because again, it's been established that the children of this man perish after having a bris milah. The Rama argues. The Rama says the Gemara only talks about children of the same woman or of sisters. It does not talk about children of the same man. And the halacha is not correct, says the Rama. Based on the Gemara, on the Talmud, if 2 children of the same man perish after having a bris milah, it's just happenstance, you do give a bris milah to the 3rd child. The only time you don't is when the 2 children share the same mother. Now, we know today that there's a disease called hemophilia. Hemophilia is an inability of the blood to clot. Today we know, and I don't know much about genetics, but it's something that's on the X chromosome. So therefore, it's transmitted by the mother, right? But it only expresses itself in a boy because a boy has an XY and not an XX. That's what makes you guys boys and not girls, right? So it's a very interesting thing that the Ramah interprets the Gemara as understanding a basic genetic fact that we understand today, which is that there's a big difference between two sons of one man and two sons of one woman. Two sons of one man, it's happenstance. It can't be a blood clotting factor because that's not how the blood factor of hemophilia is transmitted. Maybe it's some other blood clotting factor, but the obvious cause is not transmitted through a father. But the obvious cause is, we know today, transmitted through the mother. And the Gemara understood that, says the Ramah. So it's a very interesting thing how something that we know today, thousands of years later, we explained scientifically, they were already aware of this genetic distinction. And I guess there's other interpretations, but that's the most obvious one. And they were already sensitive to the difference and how a particular disease is transmitted and how it affects the ability of a child to have a bris milah or not to have a bris milah. So it's just a very, very interesting thing. And therefore, when we approach something that the rabbis, the Talmud says from a medical perspective, it's important to understand to be careful. They knew somewhat of what they were talking about. I think they knew a lot of what they were talking about. And over time, a lot of the things that they've brought down have been explained in our layman, from the Talmud's perspective, scientific terms. So now I will take some questions. But before I do that, there's a question that comes up. What happens if someone in fact did have a circumcision from a doctor in a hospital? In America today, we do circumcisions. Doctors do circumcisions when the child is 2 or 3 days old. I don't know what they do in other countries. I know some of you are from other countries. And that's before the child's 8th day. And most often than not, the doctor is not qualified from a religious perspective to give the child a bris milah. And therefore, from a Jewish perspective, that's considered a circumcision. So how do you transform that into a valid bris milah? And the answer is that there's another component to bris milah, and that is the concept of dam bris, the blood of circumcision. Now, if a person had a circumcision once, you can't do it again, right? But what you can do is one could take a drop of blood for the purpose of bris milah, for the sake of the mitzvah of milah, and then it's considered like the person has a kosher bris. That's what's explained in the Gemara and the Rishonim. That taking of a drop of blood from that place on a man's body transforms the circumcision into a kosher bris milah. It's called hatafas dam bris, taking a drop and creating a dam bris. So that's the last point. I'll be happy to take questions, and I'm sure we could.
Why is it that the world is up against having bris? What's the problem? If a parent decides to.
That's a very interesting question. And the question really is, are parents in our society, from a medical perspective, okay, allowed to do elective surgery on their children? Now, there's certain elective surgery that we allow parents to do on their children without thinking twice about it. If, God forbid, a individual is born with 6 fingers and not 5, so I'm sure you're aware that they take off the extra finger in the hospital right away. They don't wait that long. If there's all sorts of, God forbid, malformations, minor ones. I'm not talking about something that's going to hurt the child's health or anything like that. If a person has an extra finger, he'll live a happy life. But societally, it's considered odd, and therefore we resolve that by taking it off. So that's a case of an elective surgery that we do allow parents to do for their children. There's even perhaps all sorts of dentistry surgery, which arguably is elective, right? Everybody doesn't have to have their teeth looking exactly the same way. And because of social conformity, we allow parents to perform on their children. So the argument could be made for bris milah that it would fall into somewhat of the same category. Of course, the opposing argument is that no, it's not elective per se. It's not one of the elective surgeries that's commonly done, and therefore we should wait till the child's 18. But those are the arguments, at least from my perspective, both ways. And of course, there is the other issue that it is not being performed by a doctor. Now, I happen to be one of the people on the medical board, so I deal all the time with doctors who assign other people to do procedures, which they're not supposed to do. On the other hand, we have other cases of that. For example, in America, I don't know what they have in Europe, we have something called a podiatrist. Podiatrists know a lot, they've studied a lot, but the fact is they focus on the foot and they're not qualified to do anything else. See, a regular doctor, an MD, even if he's a pediatrician, he could then, take the boards and go do something else, theoretically. But a podiatrist can only work on the foot. So the pro-argument is that a mohel, he's the expert in that type of surgery. He doesn't need to be a doctor. Just like a podiatrist, right? He's the expert. Hopefully he's learned basics of making sure the blood stops bleeding, but he's the expert in that type of surgery. So those are the arguments both ways. Yes?
What are some medical benefits that we get if we, let's say, the bris milah?
So before I answer that question, I want to reiterate that medical benefits aside, we do our bris milah because it's God commanded
Right,
us.
of course.
Okay. Now, it could be there's a reason why God. We're never going to fathom the end of all of God's reasons. But they say that it reduces cancer. That's what it's said. And there's been studies, again, there's been famous studies that it reduces the transmission of HIV.
Good enough.
So you could look these studies up. They're well-published studies in medical journals, and not, quackery.
Why is it the 8th day exactly? I mean, not in a medical term, but in terms of Torah. What does Torah say?
So the Medrash says that a baby should not have a bris milah. In the language of the Medrash is ad sheyireh pnei hamatrona tchila. Until he sees, I'll translate literally, the face of the matron. It's the same word, matrona, matron, beforehand. And that's referring to Shabbos. We don't allow a child to have a bris milah until he's experienced one Shabbos. So you could come up, like I could come up with explanations as to what the Medrash means, right? That Shabbos is also one of the key signs of the Jewish nation, right? It's something that's arbitrary, right? Because a week doesn't have to have 7 days. As a matter of fact, at the time of the French Revolution, they wanted weeks to have 10 days, I believe. So a week doesn't have to have 7 days. So it's the sign that God, right, created the world. So one could explain that before we give the child, so to speak, at least symbolically, a foundation of our emunah, of our belief system, that God created the world and rested on the 7th day, it's not even appropriate to commence the first mitzvah. Yes?
What made you want to become what made you want to become mohel in the first place? It's not. Do you know what I mean? I've never met a mohel. So what made you decide to be one?
So it's very interesting. The Gemara has a concept which is we're going to elaborate on. The short answer is I love it, but the long answer is like this. Okay, the Gemara says that has a system whereby every hour in the day is represented by one of the 7 celestial bodies. Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Saturn. Okay? I didn't say the 7 planets, what the Gemara calls the 7 celestial bodies, key celestial bodies. And every hour is represented by another one of those celestial bodies. And the Gemara says that when a person is born in a certain hour during the day, he is affected at some level by that mazel, so to speak, right? In the secular world, we have that concept, the month you're born in, right, affects how you behave, right? You've heard of that? Okay. So the Gemara has a similar type concept. So the Gemara says, if a person is born between 6 and 7 o'clock on Friday afternoon, 6 and 7 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, that's the mazel of Madim, Mars. Now, what color is Mars? Mars is red. And the person has a predilection to murder people. No, really. So, like in all traits that God gives us, right? God gives each and every one of us traits, right? And our choice in life is not the traits that we were born with. It's how to use those traits, right? So the Gemara says that if a person is born with a mazel of madim, they should either become a mohel or a shochet and channel those urges to the right places. I was born between the hour, I'm serious, it's between 6 and 7, Yerushalayim Mir HaKodesh. By the way, it goes by the clock hours, not Shazmanis. Between 6 and 7 o'clock on a Friday evening. My brother was born on a Shabbos morning during the hour that also falls out to the cycle of Madim, because it's 7 celestial bodies. So, right, it's 7 plus 7. So he's a shochet. But
What's a shochet?
a ritual slaughterer. So he's even more like, So that's a long answer to your question. But the truth is, like in anything in this world, you have to love doing it. One should never, ever do anything that they don't love doing. From the time I was a young boy, I always wanted to be a mohel. Now, my grandfather was a mohel. My grandfather was a mohel. And he was given a meal knife by his father-in-law. So that's right. You could go back those generations, right? So I got that meal knife, right? Because through what we call inheritance, right? Jews are big into that stuff. I got the meal knife through that, but I only use it for family. I don't. So that's awesome. But it was something I always really wanted to do, and then I went ahead and did it. Yes.
Did you make a living off being a mohel alone, or do you need a side job?
You want to go into the career also? Theoretically, there are top mohelim that do make a living off of it. The style in America, over time, the younger mohelim tend to be doing it on the side. But I'm sure there's people that make very nice livings off it. Yes.
So before you became a mohel, you had to practice, I guess. How'd you do that? Would people like give you their children so you could practice on? Or?
It's a very good question. Let me tell you the story. The first baby I did a bris on was my nephew.
I want to meet him. Wow.
No pressure.
I had gone around with mohelim for a long time, but I never actually did one. It's a good question. And then my nephew was born, and I had another mohel come and stand with me. So then I had a son. Then my son was born. And I also had someone stand with me. And then I went for 2 weeks to Europe to study Mila. And I studied Mila in Europe with Dr. Spitzer, who's the head of the mohelim in Europe. He's a doctor. He's the chief medical officer. And I went there for 2 weeks for the following reason, a very interesting reason. He said to me, I was going to go for a couple months. He said, don't come for a couple months. Maybe you don't have the skill set for it. He said, if you have the natural inclination, I can make you into a good mohel, but I can't take a guy who has 2 left hands and make them into a mohel. You're going to waste your time and your money, so come for 2 weeks. It was a very wise suggestion. So I had one child. He was 5 weeks old, right? My father's a pediatrician, so I had the shots given early. Anyways, so he was 5 weeks old, so I flew to England with him and my wife, and I was there for 2 weeks, and I practiced a little bit here and there. The first day I was there, he said, do you have insurance, student insurance? I said, no. He said, Shine, wash your hands. Okay. Anyways, so I did 1 or 2 bris in there, and then I was in Israel. I was going to go back again for 3 months, like in a while. And I had a nephew in America born. And my parents called me up and said, do you want to fly back? We'll pay for your ticket to come back and do the bris. Then I got another call from my parents, right? Their grandchild, right? They said, look. We are happy to pay for your ticket to fly back and do the bris, but we're not going to pay for another mohel to also come and stand and watch you do the bris. That's a lot of money. So you make a decision. Either someone else does the bris or you come back and do it by yourself. So I said, I have to think about that one. So I said, okay, let me call Dr. Spitzer. He was my Rabbi in England. So I called him up. I said, what should I do? He said, what do you mean what should you do? Get on the plane, go back and do the bris and come back to Eretz Yisrael. So I got on the plane on a Thursday night. I did the bris Sunday morning, got on the next night and came back. So that was the first bris I did without anybody standing with me. And then I went to England for a few months and trained, and so. I trained.
Is there nothing that scares you?
What?
Is there nothing that scares you at all about the job?
If you're scared, don't do it. Do you know what? Taste something very interesting. At the end, after we have a bris suda, a bris meal, right?
Yeah.
We bench. We say blessings after meals. And we say 6 harachamans, 6 special prayers. And one of the special prayers has the following language. Ish hayore v'rachalev avodaso psula im shlosh ela lo yasela. A person who is fearful and soft of heart, his work is invalid. Now, obviously, that means on a spiritual level, right? Because if you're doing a bris, you should realize you're bringing a Jewish boy and giving him the imprint of a member of the Jewish nation. That should be in your mind as you're doing the bris, or at least beforehand, if you concentrate on the surgery then, but at least beforehand a little bit. No, really. But it also, from a practical perspective, if a person's afraid, they shouldn't be in the business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you ever given a bris milah to someone who was like older, like 5, 6 years old?
So when I was training, I helped out on brisim of older people. They jump around 5 or 6 year olds. When they're 30, they're calmer.
Are you allowed to use anesthetics for older?
Yes, absolutely. God, I hope so. Yes, but usually just use local anesthetic. But absolutely use anesthetic.
What do they do for adults?
They use an anesthetic.
Oh, I thought
No,
pain
a
was part of the
full
process.
What do you mean?
A full bris milah.
What do they do?
They use. I mean, is it more difficult? Much more. It's like a surgery. Do they?
So what they do for adults, when you do a full bris milah, obviously they use a local block, right?
But you have to do anesthetic. You have to be a doctor. Or you can just buy it yourself.
No, you have to have a doctor there.
You have to have
In America, you need to have a doctor there, of course.
So after what age do you need a doctor?
I believe anytime you're using an anesthetic, you're going to need a doctor because you're giving a thing. And the truth is that can have a chemical reaction. The person could have a reaction to it, although it is rare, it could have a reaction. So, and then you, usually you cauterize because to stop the bleeding, and then you stitch.
What happens if something goes wrong?
What do you mean?
Like, I don't know, like something just goes wrong. Like, it doesn't work out as you plan, kind of thing. What would you do?
Well, first of all, you don't just go into a bris. The way it looks at a bris, at a ceremony, is you think the mohel just rolls in there, picks the baby, and rolls out again. It doesn't work like that. I'll tell you an interesting story. I did recently a very complicated bris. Something called hypospadias. If you know what it is, fine. If not, it means that the hole is not in the right place, all right? So you can't be a clown. You have to know what you're doing. Baruch Hashem, I know how to deal with that. So I told the parents before I did the bris, I said, listen, I'll be happy to do the bris. I want you to understand that it's going to take me a few more minutes. You can't just go in and cut and this and that and be a cowboy. I said, you have to be calm and I have to measure and I have to do it slowly and carefully. They said, what do we care what you do? We hired you. You do the best job. We know you're very good. So you have to do it slowly. We don't care what anybody says. Shine. So there's a guy who I guess was learning milah or did a few brisim standing over me. So Shine, he watches me do the bris. And afterwards he turns to me and says, I saw what you did, but we do things much simpler. We just pick it up, put a shield on, and cut. I'm thinking, honey, you know nothing about bris milah. So the truth is that you look at the baby beforehand and you plan out what you're going to do. Act crazy. I personally mark off with a surgical knife. Not all mohel do that. A lot of them do, but I mark off with a surgical knife.
What do you mean by mark off?
Well, the same way a surgeon to see what he's going to cut. A surgical, not knife. I'm sorry, a surgical pen. Surgical pen. You mark off a surgical pen, and then you know what you're going to do. But I think like in anything in life, all humans can make mistakes. It's covering up the mistakes that gets you in trouble. If a person says, the baby needs a stitch, which could happen to anybody. There's going to be, in every mohel's career, there's going to be babies that need stitches. It's just going to happen. Anybody tells you it never happened, I don't believe he's telling you the truth. Right? Because you got a baby who doesn't stop to bleed as fast. Not telling you it doesn't happen every day. This is rare. So if you're a responsible fellow, baby's bleeding, you go to a doctor, you get a stitch, what's the problem? You act like a mensch, like you're a responsible person. If you try to patchkey with something that you realize is over your head, then you're not very smart. And there's a lot of mohel that know how to stitch also, so they avoid the problem. Yeah.
You know how to stitch?
I've stitched. I don't know how to stitch well enough that I would do it without someone standing there. Thank God it's never gotten to that. But all I'm saying is that it could happen, and a person shouldn't think it won't happen.
What type of liability do you take on?
What do you mean?
Like, is there any legal ramifications, so to speak, from doing it, or is that part of like a contractual agreement that?
That's an interesting question. That's,
Like, has a family ever, sued, perhaps?
I just mean hypothetically.
Yeah.
look, every time these cases happen, the Molim study them. And the question is how things could happen. So the truth is that the whole business, if a mohel cuts off too much or too little skin, it doesn't really in the long term make such a big difference. I mean, you don't do something that's stupid, but it's not, in the long term, it doesn't really make a difference. It's going to heal. Obviously, if you cut in the wrong place, that's very dangerous. And whenever those types of things happen, the obvious question is how possibly could the mohel make a mistake? I mean, anybody's human, but, how could a mistake have been made? I believe there is one case that was in litigation about a year or two ago. But, when it came out, I spoke to the person who taught me Mila, and I spoke to other famous Molim, I don't want to quote them, about what happened. They had investigated the case to see exactly what happened, what went wrong. Was it a case where someone, God forbid, pushed the mohel, which could happen? You could be standing in a crowd, people, someone could push you. It happens to doctors too. Doctors get pushed also during surgery. Mistakes happen. A person could slip, chas v'shalom. Question is why?
When they do it in the hospitals, they use such a thing like a clamp, they call it. Is it? I mean,
Well,
what
that's the thing.
causes less pain to the kid? They have the
Well, a bris causes more pain. Bris causes less pain to the kid, but it causes bleeding. And we hold that the bleeding is an integral part, the dam habris, the blood of the covenant. In a spiritual sense, it also is that ability that each and every one of us has to give up our lives to sanctify God's name if, God forbid, the need arises. And that's inculcated in us with a little baby where, so to speak, symbolically, some blood is given up at a young age. Now, in the hospital, the clamp or the plastibel actually closes off the circulation, and then the skin dies off, or you just cut it off. But it's obviously more painful when you're squeezing that thing. I've watched brisim done in hospitals. My daughter, my second daughter, was born a few minutes before Shabbos. So,
6 and 7?
no, she was in the wintertime. It was 4 and 5. So she was born a few minutes. But I'll tell you, my son, who wasn't born between 6 and 10, he's already interested in bris milah. So he cuts his nails like a mohel already. He's 10 and a half years old. And he goes with me and stands there and watches avidly what I do. You got to start very young. So when my daughter was born a few minutes before Shabbos, so after she was born, obviously they took us up to the maternity floor, and that's where they do the circumcisions. So I don't know if you know, with a baby, they take the baby after the baby's born when it's the maternity floor and weigh the baby and clean the baby and whatever it is. So I went with the baby. You always have this fear they're going to switch the baby in the hospital. Okay, it doesn't happen. But anyways, maybe it does. But I don't want the baby switched, So, although in Yale New Haven Hospital, that would be quite a trick. All right. So I went with the baby, and there was a doctor doing getting ready to do a circumcision. So have some familiarity with the cast of characters in the hospital. And he saw that I was there, and I said I'm a mohel, and he invited me, one colleague invited another colleague to watch the procedure. So I watched the whole thing and how he gets it ready and the plastic bone, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I've been in operating rooms for repair of hypospadias, but I was young. It was years and years ago, 9 years ago. Anyway, so that was it. So I watched this whole thing. The funniest thing was that my poor wife had just given birth an hour before, and she was waiting for me to come back to make Kiddush for her because it was very late Shabbos. And then she starts walking to find me. Where are you? I said, I'm just watching a circumcision. Shabbos is coming in, and I'm watching a circumcision. Anyways, yeah.
That's what you see.
I think it's exciting. It's interesting. You always see.
Painful.
I mean, look, the babies always cry when you take off their diapers. So it's, I'm saying there's ways of measuring pain. Heart rates go up and things like that. So
I once saw a study that they say that when a kid gets a bris, there's like a jump. They measured once.
In pain measure?
Yeah.
For a few seconds.
Yeah, I guess so.
But when you're sitting with a plastic ball and you're squeezing and squeezing and squeezing, it's,
Mohel saying tachnun every day? Like he's saying tachnun if he's doing his brit?
No.
So there's a mohelim that doesn't say never say Tachnun if they have brit every day?
Yeah,
Yeah, you know people Moelim.
I don't necessarily.
No, there is a Moelim that doing bris every day, probably, right?
Right. So
in
then,
Jerusalem,
so then they'll never say
6
tachnun.
o'clock minyan,
And they'll never say
All the minion,
Chaim
the whole minyan.
the whole minion doesn't say.
Yes.
Wow.
Okay.